Maurissa Horne is the International Middle Years Curriculum IMYC Coordinator at Precious Treasures International School in Turks and Caicos. She has been an educator for 16 years working with middle and high school students from grades 7 to 11. Her experience includes teaching English language, English literature, Caribbean history, world history, and geography. Maurissa has held several supervisory roles, including Dean of Discipline, Language Department Head, and Year Group Leader. Precious Treasures International School has been using the IMYC for 5 years and will be seeking accreditation later in 2022. I would like to warmly welcome Maurissa to our specialist series. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lee, for having me.
Well, we like a backstory whenever we start our interviews, so we'd like to know a little bit about you. What led you into education? And can you tell us a bit about your school and where you are now?
Okay, great. Lee, interestingly enough, when I was a teen growing up, being a teacher was not in the cards for me. However, it was a path that I ultimately explored, and I questioned it myself to be the best that I could be. I was motivated to change the way students can access and understand knowledge. I recall some of my teachers never really explaining the why questions to me, never answering my why questions. Rather, they were more focused on insisting that I acquire the knowledge for the purpose of recall. And so from the very first day that I began teaching, I started keeping that approach in mind, that I'll make sure my students always understood the whys, made sure that my lessons were more inclusive and differentiated so that all the children had the best opportunity for learning. So that's really what led me into education. I'm currently an English language teacher and IMYC coordinator at the Precious Treasures International High School in the Turks and Caicos Islands. At my school, learning is student-centered and focused on the children, meeting them where they are and taking them to the best levels that they can be. Learn at the school is very much based on a holistic development of our children. Our goal is to provide young people with the tools necessary for them to develop into stimulating and well-equipped citizens of the world. Our vision is to create an environment that facilitates great learning and to develop an international reputation for excellence in education. So that's just a little background to who I am and where I am now.
Very good. And so today we'd like to talk about kind of the theme about reflection. So in the International Middle Years Curriculum, or IMYC, we have something called the process to facilitate learning. This process is repeated many times throughout an academic year, providing familiarity and routine to a student's learning journeys. So within the process is a mini cycle of research, record, and reflection. And that can be repeated several times for student learning. With your experience in the classroom, how does the reflection piece of this mini cycle look and feel like for a student?
All right, so through the practice of reflection, our students are given the opportunity to share what they have acquired or consolidated. They're presented with opportunities to become aware of and can describe their thinking in a way that allows them to sort of narrow the gap or close the gap between what they know and what they need to learn. So our students reflect on or reflect using our suggested resources, such as reflective questioning, which may be completed in oral form, written, or recorded format. We use KSU table response sheets, lesson exit tickets, which we either do online or hard copy, video or audio recordings, assessment rubrics, so many other things. So we have a lot of tools that we use to ensure that our students are able to think about learning, think about how they learn and what they would need to assist them if they're having difficulties or challenge with learning. So as you rightly said, the mini cycle in the mini cycle in the subject learning activities or subject learning tasks, it does include reflection, because reflection should take place constantly. we should constantly be reflecting. Students should be constantly reflecting on the learning that takes place. So in the classroom, we equip them with the tools necessary. We have those questions, those resources, and we encourage our children to constantly reflect on what they're learning.
So there's another part of the process to facilitate learning as we go through it, and that's called the overarching reflection. So what is the difference between the general reflection in the mini cycle previously mentioned and this overarching reflection near the end of the process?
All right, so the reflection in the mini cycle, like I said, takes place more specifically during the lesson, in the single lesson or individual lessons or group of lessons that you do. And the aim of this, again, is to guide students, to provide them with that opportunity for correction, for improvement, so that they can reflect on the skills or knowledge being attained, or you require them to attain, and how they can best move forward. The overarching reflection is more summative in nature. This one is intended for students to reflect on their ability to acquire all of the subject learning goals of the unit. And so students get to discuss the link between the subject, the personal, and international learning to the theme and big idea covered. So the mini reflection, that's part of the subject learning cycle. It's more specific for the lesson, and for specific learning goals, it might be one or two, while the overarching one tends to capture how students are able to gather the knowledge, skills, and demonstrate understanding. The overarching reflection supports the majority of the key needs of the adolescent brain as well. So when students are able to complete that part of the reflection activity, the overarching one, they're able to demonstrate agency, interlinking meaning, making meaning, working with peers. You see a lot of those key needs of the adolescent brain being developed and being brought to the awareness of students versus the reflection in the mini cycle. Overall, students are more aware of what they learn when they reflect, which helps them with their future learning. And so it's very important that students not only reflect at the end of the lesson, but at the end of the 6-week cycle of learning that takes place using our curriculum.
Yeah, nicely said and nicely defined. Because sometimes I think, defining the sense of what reflection is in two parts, I think is very important when you go through the cycle, that process to facilitate learning.
Yes.
So journaling is a big component of the reflective process in the IMYC classroom. What are some ways for teachers to encourage students to journal and to reflect upon and make meaning of their learning? And what other reflective practices can be used beyond journaling?
All right. So teachers definitely should encourage their students to journal and reflect upon what they're learning and make a meaning of learning. And some ways they can do so is by providing the reflective questioning. Now, reflection, although we tend to think it's something very simple to do, we think about what we're doing. For children, they may need some guidance. So teachers can provide those reflective questions to help guide the students in terms of looking at their own learning, the process of learning, and assisting them. Also, they should channel their activities where there are moments for reflection. So it's not just the reflective questioning, but the actual activities or learning tasks themselves can lend to the environment of reflection at the end of it. For example, activities such as peer reviews and collaborative work lend itself for reflections either during the process or at the end. They should try to make reflection exercises short so that students see the value in reflection and not see it as a monotonous task or something tedious. Also, teachers should try to avoid giving overarching journaling questions at the end of the unit. Because from my experience, I've found that students can find this overwhelming at times after doing much rigorous study. Then we have these 7 or 8 questions that they would have to answer. And so if you try to stagnate or you spread those questions throughout the units where they apply, that will also help students to see the value and encourage them to reflect on their learning. Also, using journal questions to have one-on-one conversations with students definitely helps the students to appreciate the activity and to journal more. When you use these questions with one-on-one conversations with your students, it helps to guide the conversation. It helps them to be more open about their learning, to do more introspection, and for you, the teacher, to provide meaningful feedback, which the students can then apply to improve their learning. And it also helps them to recognize the importance of thinking about their learning as well. And finally, I will just say providing feedback on reflection can actually motivate. So one final way to encourage students to journal and reflect would definitely be to provide feedback on those reflections so that the reflections have more meaning. In terms of other reflective practices that go beyond journaling, there are a few that we can think about. You can have projects or activities at the end of the academic year, for example, or the end of the term, much like an end of term assessment. And this project should be constructed in a way where students can see the value in discussing what was learned, their ideas, proposals, and improvements for the future. So definitely having projects, media projects, artistic presentations, maybe mind mapping their learning, doing art pieces. So journaling and reflection should not only be isolated to the idea of journaling, but students should be allowed to understand that reflection can take place in other means. So having that project is one. Another thing that they can definitely do is to maybe give them whys and hows questions and have them think about it and maybe document it, maybe using a video recording, a movie, role play. There's so many other activities, reflective activities students can engage in to make learning meaningful and for them to be able to do metacognition, recognizing the way they learn and how they can improve.
So on that, is there any examples or any stories you can tell about some reflective practices that you've done or you've seen in the classroom?
Sure. So in the classroom, had students do video presentations for reflections, and the students put together their own vlog of their experience with the subject content. They talked about what they were able to understand, what they know. So we use the KSUs. They talked about the skills they gathered. They talked about their understanding of the whole concept of the unit. And then they also discussed their strengths, their own strengths, weaknesses. The students were also encouraged to talk about how they would improve the delivery of the lesson, what they would have included, what they may have omitted. And then they submitted it, and they were very happy. Students were pleased that their voices were heard, and it was another opportunity for them to get to know themselves and to also understand how they learn. A lot of the students actually, when you speak to them before giving them that reflective activity, they tend to think they learn in one way. And when they start thinking about the activities, the tasks, the challenges, the accomplishments, they recognize that their learning styles might be a little bit different. It might be a combination of others. And so they're able to use that information to assist them in the units that come in the future. So it's really exciting to see when our students reflect and how they use that knowledge and information to help them acquire further learning in the future.
Well, which leads me to the other side here. What would a classroom look like without reflective practices in place? So It's very common, I feel like, in education that reflection often gets ignored in the learning process. Why do you think so?
Ah, people seem to think that reflection is not necessary, it's extra work, um, it's not a big deal, when in fact, reflection is a critical component of learning, I think. Now, if we imagine ourselves as individuals and the way we learn or the way we think, the way we do things, we don't just, as responsible adults, we don't just act without thinking of consequences, without thinking about the hows and the whys, and without thinking about our position in a decision or our position in acquiring something. We always think about things. And so to omit reflection from a lesson, I think it's absurd
Mhm.
to say the least, because it's so important. Now, these are children who are at a critical stage in their lives, it's adolescent period, where lots of things are happening, including pruning. And so we have to make sure that whatever it is our students are doing, they see it as important and that they wouldn't get rid of it. So a classroom without reflection is going to be one where children are being programmed like robots, right? It's a classroom, a space where we have children, we program them, and it's either they get it or they don't. There's accuracy or there's failure. Um, so if those are some of the casualties you can have. The students would not be able to make connections between previous learning and new learning. The students would not be able to appreciate the purpose of learning. If students are having difficulty with a task, how would they problem solve, or how would they try to conceptualize an alternative if they're not reflecting? And so the students are being set up for failure if we do not encourage reflection in a classroom. And not only would it be a failure for students, but it would also be a failure for a teacher if reflection isn't encouraged in the classroom. Because as much as we're trained to deliver knowledge and skills to enhance understanding of our students, there are times when we would have to reflect. We'd have to do some introspection. We would have to upgrade our skills. We'd have to adapt to the times. And so reflections helps to serve as a means or stop point for us to evaluate what's been happening, take a closer look, make tweaks, and seek improvement. And so imagine a teacher who's not reflecting on the lesson, who's not thinking about the students who are not doing well, who's not thinking about the approaches and methodologies and teaching one way all the time to different types of people, then we're setting ourselves up for failure, really. So reflection is so important
And
for a classroom teacher.
I'm glad you brought that up about that it's not just student reflection, but also teacher reflection as well. I mean, as educators, we need to reflect on what we're doing. So yeah, we can improve as well in the process, not just one way. So what are some ways that teachers can reflect on their work? Can you think of some times when you yourself did some major reflection, or are there any practices that you recommend?
Sure. At my school, what we have done is we've built in a reflection section in our lesson planning document. So we have a soft copy lesson planning document that's collaborative, all teachers work on it together. And we have a section for reflection, facilitators reflection, and next steps. So that's just one way in which we encourage reflection, because it is indeed very important. In the classroom, you're going to meet challenges, you're going to have successes and accomplishments. And we need to store that information. So let's just move away from the idea of reflection as, oh, my lesson was great, my lesson was wonderful, or I was a good teacher, I'm not a good teacher. Reflection goes beyond those opinions or thoughts. It's where you look at your lesson, you discuss the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You do a SWOT analysis. So we built that into our lesson planning documents, and I would definitely recommend other schools if they're not doing it, to include it. It's really a critical component. And by having our document being so collaborative, other teachers can review the reflections of their colleagues and either see similar experiences and even find solutions or suggestions as to how they can address certain issues. That's just one way a teacher can reflect on the work. Another way is to have colleagues come to your classes. I've had that done. I remember when I just started at my current school, I would invite a former IMYC coordinator to my classes and ask for her feedback because I wanted her honest opinion. I wanted to improve. I wanted to see how well I measured up to a particular standard. So having your colleagues sit in your class and discuss the lesson, the strengths and the weaknesses of your lessons and how you can improve is definitely another way you can reflect on your lessons. You can even have your students share in that observation. You can have them fill in survey forms asking specific questions. For example, what parts of the lessons were enjoyable? How would they improve? Rate the use of resources, media presentations. You can list items that you want them to rate. For example, if you use videos or audio, which assist them with learning better, etc. So having students being part of the reflective process is another way a teacher can reflect on their work. You can record your lessons and do some reflection on your own work. Keep a journal. I have a reflective journal that I like to make my little notes and, from time to time update it and make my own recommendations to research. There's one that I recommend to teachers at times called a reflective checklist. This helps to keep you in line and streamline your work so that you're capturing those areas that are critical to the lesson. And you can compare yourself to an expert. This I did a lot, especially earlier in my teaching career. There are teachers who I love, who I would like to be like still. I strive to be like. They're experts in the field. And so by looking at those areas that you admire and you look at your own work, it would help you to improve as you aspire towards that level of greatness or expertise. Yeah, those are some of what I would suggest are ways in which teachers can reflect on their work.
Those are some great ideas. And especially that last part where you said about basically having a model,
Yes.
something to strive for and look up to, and to see how they made excellence in what they do in their field. So
Definitely.
that's great. So how can journaling and other reflective processes help with building a relationship with students? Because we've been talking a lot about reflection, but I'm also curious about the idea of relationships through that as well.
Right. So building relationships with your students, that's absolutely critical because the effective teacher is that teacher who's able to build a great relationship with the students, relationship of trust, so that that child knows that you have their best interests at heart, right? And so by reflecting, offer reflection in classes, it would definitely help the students to build that relationship. What you can do is have use the reflective practice to have rapport with children and then address the concerns that they have. And I'll share an example with you. I have a student currently who has some reading challenges, and I had discovered there was a need for further assistance, external assistance for this child. And the way I discovered that was based on the questions, the way the student responded to reflective questions in class. I noticed a consistent pattern and I approached the child. We had a discussion about it. And then I asked what were the challenges that the child thought they had, if there are any, and the child was able to successfully identify those challenges that I myself had concerns about. We talked about how long the problem had persisted. We talked about what could possibly happen, what suggestions, what the child would like to see being put in place. We talked about the plan, and then I was able to, through my principal, seek external assistance for this child. And so whenever this helped to build a good relationship between myself and that child, because now the child knows I have their best interest at heart, and whatever I do, I am doing it so that they are getting the best option. They're getting the best experience based on the challenges that they've expressed to me. And of course, it was done in such a way that it was very discreet from the rest of the class, so that there was a level of trust there. And we also do a lot of reflection post that time, right? So that we can talk about progress, we can talk about accomplishments, and the struggle that continued. So I would definitely would encourage the use of reflections because it helps to build the relationship between the teacher and students. And reflection helps you to understand all of your students. So even if it's not, even if you do not get children to come to you and talk about the issues, it helps you to understand their learning styles, understand the problems they may have, and how you can assist them, or who you can refer to. So for example, if a geography teacher is using the reflective practice of, let's say, reflective questions at the end of the lesson, written form, and that geography teacher notices one student has subject verb agreement problems or some writing issue, that can be brought to the attention of the language teacher. And so the child is able to get help for that issue, and reflection helps to do that. The journaling definitely helps to do that. Another way that you can help to build the relationship with students from journaling and your reflective practices is to definitely help to develop a sense of self. Now, when you guide children into the practice of doing introspection or looking inward, their learning patterns and their habits, etc., what's stressing them or what's causing them problems, you're helping these children to develop a greater sense of self. And when a student is aware of themselves, the way they learn, what are their limitations, and how they can improve, this greatly increases the student's self-esteem, self-confidence, and the way they're going to perform in their learning tasks. Because with confidence, you know that that child is going to give their best. They're going to use or research in the best means necessary. They're going to use the medium that is going to guarantee better success for them because they're more well aware of themselves. So reflection helps you to develop a child's sense of self, which leads to, again, confidence in the classroom. And then, of course, reflections helps to develop an environment of trust. Because if children recognize that my teacher is concerned about me, my teacher values my opinion, my teacher is interested in knowing my thoughts about things, my ideas, my suggestions, my proposition, then they're more likely to share in other areas. They'll be more open for classroom discussions, and it creates an environment of trust in the classroom, which is crucial and critical to the adolescents.
And on that, looking at as you're saying about reflection, it sounds like reflection also through journaling or beyond that starts a dialogue. It starts a conversation in many ways. Whether you detect something that maybe it's a language issue or maybe it's something that's personal to them, a conversation is starting to open, and I think that that has power, and as you said, it brings that trust and respect and confidence to grow and become stronger as a learner. So it's very interesting. Just adding to that, has that sense of reflection maintained during some of this time when we've been offline and doing things virtually?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I think reflection became extremely important during the pandemic and being online because our students had so many things to they're faced with, to deal with, to manage. And sometimes I think adults might try to minimize the impact that young people, the adolescents, face during this time. But the reflective practice definitely made us as teachers aware of how students were impacted by the sudden change from either the blended or in-person approach to the totally online approach. My students were encouraged to reflect. They reflected at the end of every lesson in using different mediums. And what we realized is that students were having challenges not only with grappling with the pandemic, but they had challenges such as environmental challenges, noisy background, which hindered learning, access to consistent internet, which of course affected the ability to acquire knowledge and to do their research. They also had self-esteem issues. A lot of them had not withdrawal, but they had some challenges with not being able to socialize, and that was a big one. You know, when they came to class, they were a bit excited to meet their friends, a bit chatty, but they also wanted that peer-to-peer contact, which was missing from the classroom. So when they were given the opportunity to reflect, they share how they felt, and we also provide them the opportunity to suggest how we can improve the learning experiences for them. And when we did put those measures in place that were practical and possible, it greatly improved the students' performance, their outlook on the classes, and their general participation in our lessons. So it was very important, especially during this time, that reflection was done. And if you think of it, as adults, as teachers, or principals, or education departments, they were checking in on the teachers to make sure they were okay. They were asking to think about the period, reflect on the use of technology, reflect on how students were acquiring their knowledge, and so on. So why not offer that for our students? So if it's important for us, of course, it's definitely important for them to reflect on the learning, and reflective practices of any form was so instrumental during this time. And it continues to be. It continues to inform us. It continues to help us to make decisions for the future. And it also it allows our children to know that we care. You know, the reflective practices allows us to show them that we're concerned about how they learn, and we're concerned about their thoughts and their ideas.
And it sounds like through that reflection and that change of how we learn and how we, go to school and socialize, with that reflection comes a lot of awareness, it sounds like. The awareness that my teacher, will go that extra mile and care for me, or that the fact that yeah, that I didn't realize how noisy it is in my home, or I didn't
Yes.
realize how internet is so important and valuing
Yes.
that. So I can
Yes.
really see how that all that reflection through this pandemic has definitely give rise to maybe some changes through all these reflections that we've been in.
Yes, it definitely has. And I'm so happy that we have a curriculum that heavily emphasizes the importance of reflection, because I've had experiences, of course, in the traditional classroom type, and I could only imagine um, the levels of frustration students and my colleagues would have, teaching colleagues would have, because they'll be meeting with a lot of challenges, but you're not quite sure how best to address them, because any approach you take would always exclude one party, and most often it's the students, because you're not taking the reflective exercise and practices, you're not taking those into consideration when you're making your decisions. So reflective practices, especially during the pandemic, help with shaping policies and the way forward for education. It definitely would be one of those pillars in education now and for the future.
So what is one takeaway that you would like the listeners and viewers to know about with your time and experience with the IMYC? We've talked a lot about relationships and reflection. Is there anything else that you would like to share?
Definitely. Now the IMYC it's relatively new in terms of its content and its philosophy. However, it's very inclusive. Now, in the traditional approaches to teaching and learning, some students struggle with closing the gaps between knowledge and skills provided and the understanding of it. Now, the IMYC, through its process for improving learning, has designed a learning cycle that truly gives students opportunities to make connections and meaning, to interlink learning so that it makes sense for them. I would like listeners and viewers to know that the contemporary classroom and learners are no longer challenged with acquiring knowledge and skill. Their challenge actually goes beyond that, because knowledge and skill is everywhere, it's accessible. What the modern learner or the contemporary learner is struggling with or would face is the application of knowledge and skills in complex situations. The IMYC gives students the tools and support necessary to apply that learning in so many situations. And so I would say to our listeners and viewers that you should really consider the science behind IMYC. And even if you do not look at the science itself, just take a look at the way the young people are acting and operating. When you ask a child a question, they know the information, but the challenge really is how to use that information in the various situations. With our IMYC program, the tools that we provide equips them to better be able to handle those situations. And so I leave that with our viewers, that you will experience something different, something new, and it's very specific and unique to the adolescent brain, which is so important for them. So the IMYC is definitely a curriculum that I would recommend for every child in the whole world.
And for sure, with some reflection as well.
Yes, of course. Definitely with some reflection. Yes.
So thank you so much for joining us today, Maurissa, and sharing your experience and your insight on reflection and building and developing relationships. And it was just a joy to hear you and your wisdom over the years that you've been working in education. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate you, and thank you to the listeners. And I hope it was information that's meaningful for you and causes you to think about the way learning should be and the ways in which IMYC definitely can seek to improve learning for our students. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay.